So first of all, a bit of an explanation for the title, Getting Left Behind When Markets Don't Work. Of course, if you're a sociologist, you think, well, this is a nonsensical statement because labor markets are socially constructed, so of course they work exactly the way they're supposed to work. But this is very much an economics point of view, because anyone who's an economist or has gone beyond first-year economics knows that labor markets are supposed to work in the following way. Wage is supposed to equal the marginal product of labor, right? And a simple formula, if you work more, if you produce more, you get paid more. And I think what we're becoming increasingly aware of is that is just no longer the case. And so this paper is an attempt to explore exactly how labor markets are working using data I've been collecting as part of the PEPSO project, Poverty and Employment Precarity in Southern Ontario over the last decade. Some of you may have seen this, but I think this is really quite important. And certainly as an economist, this is quite important. And Jill and I will remember when we were first learning our trade back, well, not in the 50s, but let's say in the 70s. This was the data that was before us. And the data that was before us was very clear. As the red line, which is labor productivity per hour, went up, the blue line, which is wages per hour, also went up. And they basically tracked each other. And something happened in the mid-70s. Those two things do not track each other anymore. And so productivity has gone along its merry way. And since 1948, it's been up 246%. But wages basically stalled in the 70s and barely moved at all, and they're only up 114%. So another way of thinking about this is if our wages had continued to track productivity, as the economists who taught Jill and I said would happen, we'd all be paid about a third or 40% more. I could take that kind of a pay increase without any difficulty. So the question that I'm addressing in this paper is what happens to the prevalence of precarious employment when employment increases? Right? And so it's a bit of a natural experiment because the data we have is for the Toronto-Hamilton labor market. And in the period we're looking at, that labor market was booming. Unemployment was falling, employment was growing. And so we wanted to ask what happens to the prevalence of precarious employment. So this is in many ways a natural experiment comparing data we had for 2011 and data we had in 2017, survey data. And it's based on reports which are available on our website, www.pepso.ca. And the It's More Than Poverty, we published that in, I guess, 2012. And then Getting Left Behind, this is a paper we just released in May of this year, which explores this question. It's sometimes hard for us to believe, given all the doom and gloom, that actually is a labor market that's booming. But the Toronto-Hamilton labor market truly was booming between 2011 and 2017. So overall employment increased over 12% in this period. Full-time employment, 12%. Part-time employment, 10%. And the unemployment rate fell from 8% down to 6%, right? So it was a very healthy labor market in this period. Wages continued to lag labor productivity, so that graph we had from the United States, that continues to be the case. Hourly productivity in this period was up 7%. Weekly wages were up about 1%. So workers did not gain the wage increases from producing more and more. If we look at some of the forms of employment, permanent employment was up in this labor market about 10%. Temporary employment was up almost 19%, and own account self-employment, so our gig workers, was up 18%. So it's quite clear in terms of forms of employment, there's a lot more insecure, precarious employment going on. So what is the study? The study, this is joint work I've been doing with United Way of Greater Toronto. We're doing population surveys done by a professional polling firm, asking people about the nature of their employment. So in 2011, we had a random survey of just over 4,000 individuals. We went back again in 2017. We have about 2,000 individuals in the database there. All these people are 25 to 65, so we've dropped out a lot of the millennials, students, etc. And it covers the Hamilton GTA labor markets, that horseshoe around the end of Lake Ontario, which is basically a unified labor market of around 5 million people. So first thing we needed to do is define precarious employment. And we took a long time in the project in doing this. And we looked at two ways of defining precarious employment. One is simply the form of the employment relationship. So are you a temp agency worker? Are you a permanent full-time worker? Are you a short-term worker? Are you self-employed? And you can get some of that data, not all of it from official sources, but that's a very limited way of understanding who's in precarious employment. Because what we have found is you can say you're in permanent full-time employment, and you know what? When you dig down into it, your job looks a whole lot like you came out of a temp agency. You don't know your schedule. You don't know if you're really going to have a job. You're not sure what your earnings are going to be. So the official data, to my mind, really masks what's going on. And so we developed what we call the Employment Precarity Index, which is an index of 10 survey questions, which we argue give a relatively accurate picture of insecurity in terms of employment. And again, we've been doing this for a while, so this is all available in our studies. You can look at it in more detail. But the Employment Precarity Index is made up of the 10 questions on the left side here, which together, I would suggest, offer a pretty good picture of what's insecure. You're not paid if you miss work. Your weekly income is not stable. You're paid in cash. Weak voice at work. So particularly for Canadians, this is a problem. You can't put your hand up and say, excuse me, because we're polite. I think my job is killing me. Would you change something? So if you can't do that, there's a degree of insecurity at the workplace. What we don't include is income. And this was a by design because we wanted to look at the interaction between poverty and income, and also in part because there have always been low-paid workers. What I think is new is there are now a lot of workers who are not low paid but are insecure. Right? So this insecurity is becoming more prolific throughout the economy. It's becoming the norm as it replaces the standard employment relationship. So we're going to use both the form and the index to get an understanding what's happened in this booming labor market to different kinds of workers. So the first observation, this is the first thing that came out of our study, is yes, there is less insecure employment. The gold part of the pie, these are people who are in what we call a standard employment relationship. So they have a full-time job, they told us it's permanent, they have some benefits, and they expect to have that job in a year. And you can see it's gone from about 50% of the workforce in 2011 to about 56% of the workforce in 2017. So there's been about a 10% increase in the amount of permanent full-time employment, standard employment. And there's been a decline in some of the other portions. Where there hasn't been a decline is this gray, dark gray, which these are forms of the employment relationship, which most people would say are precarious. So this is working through a temp agency, own account self-employment, short-term employment. It's barely budged at all. And the transition has been mostly from some part-time jobs have been converted into permanent full-time jobs, and this rose-colored slice of the pie, these are people who say, I'm in permanent full-time job, but I don't know if I'm going to have it in a year. I don't get any benefits, so it's clearly not a standard employment relationship, but it's a full-time job. So there's been some shrinkage there. So the first story is things are getting better. And I have to admit, when we first saw this, we said, geez, we are in trouble now because the story we've been trying to tell can no longer be told. The market works. We then drilled down to look in more detail at different groups and how they experience this booming market. And we divided our sample into eight categories by university degree, by race, and by sex. Right? So from the top, we had white males with a university degree. At the bottom, we had racialized women without a university degree. So we wanted to look at those eight. And wow, what is the conclusion? Well, the conclusion in this booming labor market, it's a whole lot better to be a white male with a university degree than anybody else. They gained a significant amount, and the yellow here indicates those who had significant improvements. So if you're a white male with a degree, more likely to be in a standard employment relationship. Female white with a degree, somewhat better. Male racialized with a degree, somewhat better. For everybody else, this labor market didn't help you. So the labor market's booming, but you still are just as insecure as you were in 2011. This looks at using the Employment Precarity Index. Again, exactly the same story. White males, their employment precarity scores declined. White women with a degree, racialized men with a degree declined somewhat. For everyone else, they're standing still. They are not moving forward. There may have been a few people went up and a few people went down, but statistically, there is simply no difference for these groups between 2011 and 2017. And what it means is that, at least in terms of insecurity, our society is now more polarized than it was in 2011. Right? So those at the top have got more security. Those at the bottom have not got any more security. And so insecurity has become less equally distributed in 2017 as than 2011. So a booming market is bad for equity. I'm going to skip this one. So the other half of this is looking at income, and here the story is a little bit different. On average, incomes did not go up at all significantly over this period, but two groups actually did gain average income. And that's somewhat surprising. Males, white, without a degree, males racialized without a degree. And our hypothesis here, what this is reflecting, is less short time in manufacturing and construction. So their hourly wages aren't going up, but the number of hours they work are going up, and so their annual income is going up. But for everyone else, a booming labor market doesn't put more money in your pocket. I'm going to skip this one too. This is, I think, a bit of a puzzle. Despite this booming labor market, what we're not seeing is an improvement in mental health. Actually, the prevalence of poor mental health is actually going up rather than going down. And I think that speaks something to the broader set of factors that are going on in our society. Of course, 2017, well, there was a whole different political regime in place in 2017 than 2011. And this seems to be contributing to a lot of anxiety that's not being buffered by a better labor market. Okay, so what does all this mean? Closing up, perfect. First of all, what it means is that for most workers, an improving labor market does not lead to improved employment security. I do a lot of media work, and I'm sure other people here do, and I'm sure you're often told, well, look, let's just make the labor market work better, more employment, things will be better. I think the answer here, that's not right. It's true if you're a white male with a university degree. For everybody else, it's much more questionable. And if you don't have a degree or you're racialized, it simply is not the solution that you need. Workers without a degree, especially racialized women without a degree, are simply being left behind. They're actually losing ground in an improving labor market, which is certainly not what Jill and I were told in our economics courses. The mechanisms that allocate employment security seem to be a little bit different than the mechanisms that allocate income. These two things are not moving in the same direction. I think, again, that's an interesting question that's worth exploring why that's the case. And I think what this really, at least it says to me, is the importance of policy, whether it's improving unions so they can defend those who are less able to defend themselves, whether it's government policy, et cetera, the kind of things that were happening in Ontario until last week with the new government now, which is gutting all those labor policies. I think it really speaks to the direction that governments were taking in terms of improving labor standards and things like that. And now that they're not, I think the fear is many people will get left behind. And certainly when the labor market starts collapsing, inevitably it will, it's quite, equity I think will be a huge concern. And I think I'm going to stop. Right. I'm going to stop there. We have actually put our employment precarity index up online, an app, believe it or not. What a technological advance that is for me. You can go here and you can actually fill in the 10 questions. It will calculate your employment precarity index, and then it'll tell you how you score against our other folks, tell you whether you're precarious or in secure employment, and then give you some clues on how you can start the revolution to make things work better. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much.